Hi and welcome back. I have missed you and I'm sorry I did not post at all last week. I had been in Paris, as many of you know, and I tried to have videos preloaded every day, and I thought, okay, there'll be no gaps when I got back, but the truth was a lot of things came up for me on my trip, both emotionally and about how I'm sort of functioning in life, and I needed to have some time to get back on track at home and with patients, and I just found myself, to be honest, feeling this block, and I think I just needed a little more time. So I'm sorry I've not been here, but I am happy to be back. I keep wanting to come up with new ways to share here, and I haven't quite figured out what those are going to be. So for now, I think we'll just stick with what I know that that seems to be hopefully working most of the time. I can hear the cat bowl dripping. I'm going to turn that off really quick. I'll be right back. Okay, so I actually had a lot of things happen on my trip that I want to share with you in terms of psychological issues, insights I had. I'm going to make videos about a few of those. But this video actually came up in response to my trip in some ways, because I had a lot of things come up with both of my parents, both my biological father dynamic, which is a whole other thing, and with my mom. And so a lot of content has come out of that. And so, as many of you know, I went to Paris alone. I've gone now twice to Paris alone. The last time was about 8 years ago. And I cannot recommend, even if you're just going to go camping down the street alone, the idea of having time alone, it's a privilege, I know, to be able to travel. It was quite crowded there, but it was really good for me. It was also a very emotional situation, which I wasn't expecting. So I will get to that at some point. All right, but let's get into one of the things I became really aware of as I reflected on my content is that I talk so much about childhood CPTSD and childhood wounding. And I should say, a lot of when I talk about what happened with my mom, especially, who I believe is an undiagnosed human who has borderline PD, and now that I'm doing a deep dive into high masking autism, I have some questions there, but definitely a lot of the criteria do meet that dynamic. And what I haven't really, I think, been as clear about is that a lot of the trauma I experienced with her happened in my 20s, 30s, and 40s. Because where it got really bad, so I have childhood, like many of you, and some memories, and a lot of things I know happened, but the bulk of the wounds I have, and the reason why I don't have connection with her, is because of the way she behaved in my adult life, specifically around directly being hurtful once I chose a partner and got married. And I do believe that core of feeling abandoned and the dynamics over the course of my marriage and then divorce really prompted and fueled a lot of the trauma that I had with her. And so as I've been doing this work now for quite some time, I've had many people come to me who not only had these complicated, often enmeshed, parentified, emotionally and relationally difficult parents, but they were often frequently or recently still in those relationships. And I've talked a lot about why I've made this channel, and a lot of it is that at that time, though I knew it wasn't quite normal, it was my normal. And I wish I'd understood the amount of trauma, and I would have times where I would stop talking to her and we'd have conflict. But for a large number of years, until I went full no contact about 5 years ago, it was just a very unhealthy situation. And so, but also very intense. And that is really number one of this whole signs. I want to go through the signs for you that you may be in a very unhealthy relational dynamic, often with what I call eggshell parents, because that kind of sums up where it's like you don't really know what's going to happen next, but you're basically in it with them. That's what often happens. And so these parents often were eggshell, of course, in childhood. But I think when they're hurting you as adults and you already have a history of what you deem normal, it just becomes this like car accident you can't look away from because you're constantly in it. So the first thing is, number one, it is a love-hate cycle. And this is adult complex PTSD with eggshell parents or complicated parents. So you love them so much, it's so intense, you cannot imagine how you will survive when they are no longer here. And then when it's bad, you literally say you hate them, you feel hatred towards them, you think about them not being here anymore, and you feel tremendous guilt about that for even thinking it, and yet it also feels very relieving. But even the idea of it feeling relieving can make you feel bad. Or, you just don't want to make a public announcement. Maybe you really do feel that way. But also you're going to be kind of wrecked when you think about them passing because of that intense nature of the relationship. So there's a very strong love-hate cycle. Number two, it's a help-hurt cycle. So often these parents will help you. They will take care of your kids. They will be there for emotional support when you're in a bad place. They'll give you money. They'll, whatever it is, or they'll help you in some way. And then they can also be incredibly hurtful. So it's help, hurt. That's what makes these relationships, I think, even harder to kind of see from a distance, is that it's like this and it can be so good and so bad. But they're doing something to help you, but also no one can hurt you often as much as they can. The next one is you're vulnerable in some way. So you need their help, like I said. You're a single parent, you need childcare, you need financial support, you need emotional support, you're in a bad marriage or bad relationship. And when things are bad, they're often really good. They like it when you're splitting with a partner because it creates a space for them. Maybe you have medical needs, whatever it is, but there's a vulnerability that you have that often began in childhood. Maybe it's morphed over time where you become more and more and more of the parent, and you often were, but you feel like you can't separate from them, or you feel that their mental health is too vulnerable, or whatever the relational dynamics where there's just a vulnerability often on both sides. The next thing is that they don't respect boundaries. There are no boundaries around what they say to you, how they treat you, the way they talk about you, your things, whatever it is. And if you try to even consider setting them, it tends to blow things up. They take it very personally, or they will push back very, very, distinctively in a way that you feel like, okay, never mind. The next thing is, like I said, you fantasize, you feel needy, and you have this weird thing where you love them so much and hate them so much, but there's an intensity that you don't feel that anyone else in your life understands. Even your spouse will say, I don't know why you have them in your life. Or your friends will say, oh, that parent is terrible to you. And yet they don't understand. You feel like no one really gets the intensity of the relationship. They might scream at you and rage at you and call you horrible names. And then if they apologize, if they do, it might be like, in any case, a way to keep you from leaving them. They don't really seem to apologize and then have that dictate or change their future behavior. But when they're triggered, there's like no holding back in terms of how they speak to you. And you might find yourself saying and doing things to them as well that you feel terrible about, but that's the toxic cycle that you've been stuck in. They will blame you and shame you and say things like, you should be ashamed of yourself. This is your fault. If you didn't act this way, I wouldn't act this way. They never really own their behavior, and they literally and definitively blame you. You're the reason. If you would just get in line, not do that thing, give them what they want, everything would be fine. They will leave you, walk out on you, stonewall you, not return your texts, play games in terms of the silent treatment. They'll return letters unopened, whatever it is. They will shun communication from you when they're upset with you, but they often expect you to respond like that if they decide to reach out in some way. They will say inappropriate things to you in front of your children, in front of your spouse. They will try to turn your own children, your own family members, your partner against you when they're upset with you, like get on their team. They don't really have an understanding of what's appropriate in that regard. Or if they do, they don't care. They don't seem to care. They will often hate your spouse, your partner. And that's where I think the dynamic of borderline does often align, because it can feel like you're abandoning them when you choose a partner, especially if you've been parentified or enmeshed child, which you often have. It feels like a threat. And so they will actively encourage division It might even be between you and your kids, that in some way, if they can get your child, especially as your child gets older, to align with them against you, that will happen when there's conflict. You feel often responsible for them, whether it's financially, mentally, physically, emotionally, or you feel like they just can't handle, you not being there for them. And so it's this like, you're in it, you want to be out of it, but you can't control that. You have become more and more of the parent, as oftentimes as people age, they become, not always, but I often say, I have noticed that people often become more rigid. They become less flexible, less open-minded, more sure about things, which to me, it seems like as you age, not separate from your identity, but like you should be more open and more loving and more accepting of like the craziness of life. But that often for them, it becomes more narrow and more deep. And this has really been an issue in the last many years politically, in terms of our culture and society. And so if one of you is very rigid, and you already have this kind of relationship, it's often been the source of a lot of family systems really going no contact and blowing up, because that kind of stuff has cracked open what was already there. You might confide in them and they might use it against you. So any kind of secrets or sharing, or they might lie to you. You can't really trust what they say when you're not close, but when you're really in a good cycle with them, it's like everything they say feels like supportive and real and safe. And you kind of start to believe things, even though maybe your higher self is like, wait a minute, what are you doing? Because when it's good, it feels so good and safe, because it's so unsafe. And overarchingly, it is not safe. The safety is an illusion, but that's often all we've ever really had. And so in our mind, that's what it feels like. They will basically, take your things, expect you to support them, take care of them. It's a kind of one-way dynamic. And they will maybe use the currency of, well, I helped you with your kids or whatever. But when you really look at it, there's an imbalance and an expectation for you to be more of the adult. And that's why I'm saying you've often become more of the adult if you weren't already in childhood feeling like the adult. You often cry and rage and feel shame and so much hurt around them when you're upset with them. I've talked about it in a few videos. One of my last straws was me being at like 40 something years old in my closet, crying my eyes out, just like, I cannot believe that she has said those things to me again. And it triggers a lot of deep sadness and shame in you. There's always conflict. There's always a lot of feeling like you need to rescue them. And because basically in some ways you always have, whether it's being there for them emotionally, or they've rescued you at times and served a role. And maybe because of that unhealthy relationship dynamic, you have allowed unhealthy partners, unhealthy friendships, things like that. And so that can make that reliability on them even more intense when things are good and bad. And then lastly, it's like they can be really loving and yet turn on you quickly. They can create the situation where it's like an emotional roller coaster. And like I've said, if it was already set up as enmeshed, parentified, whatever it was in childhood, you just continue that. It's just now you're two adults, yet they will play the I'm your parent card even when you're 40 and they're 60. And I understand that in some, family systems and cultures, there should be a respect dynamic with aging. But when the parent is not acting in an adult role from an adult self, it's really hard to find that. And yet they will often play that card. So all of this plays out in trauma, in a very significant trauma cycle, because so many of us had this dynamic, like I said, in childhood. It becomes a bigger and bigger trauma. And because we've lived it our whole lives, we don't often see it for what it is. And that's what I was saying, is all of these things were happening the entire time, from the time I left college for 30 years. And of course, there would be times that I would think, I can't do this anymore. But there was such a normalizing of this behavior that it really took me therapy and work and support to really see the wounding nature of it, and that it wasn't going to change, because no matter how much I tried to work it out, be the therapist, have the conversations, it just got worse and worse and worse. And as I developed and matured and began to really do my own work and separate more and more, especially once I got divorced, because in the marriage you have the conflict with the parent, but you still have the partner, and the partner's like, oh, I don't know why you're in it, but I'm here for you, or whatever. But when it reaches a point where for whatever reason you feel alone in it and there's nowhere to go, and you're doing the work, you really start to see it for what it is. And I really have to say it caused a lot of damage. And so yes, that all that stuff happened in childhood when I had no power, but I willingly leaned in and accepted it because it felt so intense. Like there was so much love and we could have such a great time together and it'd be like the same sense of humor and laugh so hard. But when it would turn, it would be the most hurtful thing in my life. And of course it affected what my kids eventually were exposed to. Watching their mom and their grandmother get into it is not a great dynamic, or their grandfather and their daughter or son, whatever it is, or whoever you are, however you identify as a grandparent or parent, whatever it is. And then they often start to do the same things to your kids as your kids get older, when the kids begin to develop a separate sense of self and push back if it doesn't align. It's really damaging. And like I've said, so many of these individuals who struggle, and for you, this is just how it's always been. So I'm not going to go in today to what you can do. I have a video coming on how to heal from these dynamics and what you can work on. But I will say that, this deep resentment, this deep pain, this secrecy, this being even afraid of their punishment if they're upset with you, like in your adult body, you're still afraid of them. It may be actual fear. It might be more of an emotional fear, but it's real. It's very real, and it's very impactful, and it affects every other relationship in your life. So I would really encourage you to identify this if this is you, and to understand and have grace with yourself about why maybe you've stayed in it so long. Ideally, you try to address these relationships, set boundaries, confront and heal. But if that doesn't work, that is how we often end up in no contact. And most people do not wake up and go no contact. Contrary to what people say, it's not about that. It's often that you've tried for years. You've tried therapy. They often walk out of therapist's office, won't go to therapy, won't read books, won't take responsibility. And then you're left with what else am I supposed to do? And I just don't believe that modeling that, I don't care who someone is, that you should accept that kind of wounding is a great model for your children. I don't think that it is. And it is a very, very painful thing to do. It is not like the pain goes away if you end up in no contact, which I do believe is the last decision you make. Oftentimes, like I said, you do boundaries, you try to do gray rock, surface relationship, tea party relationship, all of that stuff. But if you've had all of that trauma and you separated, the pain is often raw and open once you realize, just like any relationship that you've been in, that it was really damaging for your well-being. So that's what it often looks like. I hope you will, like I said, have lots of love for yourself, but please consider seeking support, books, podcasts, resources, therapy groups, whatever you can, if this is you, because it's really hard to set boundaries and to hold them over the years when a part of your brain goes, wait a minute, why am I not talking to them again, right? Because it's not natural or normal or desired to have this kind of relationship with the parent, and or to be in no contact when the parent is still living. And all of that relates to kind of what happened while I was in Paris, which I will probably share in the future. But it was a lot of tears, even on a vacation. And so I just thought, I don't think I've talked enough about how this played out in my adult life. And I think that that's, in some ways, it's as damaging in a very different way, but it's just as painful. So thanks for being here. Please stay safe and well, and I'll see you soon. Bye.